Hi, welcome. This is a lesson on solving quadratic equations by taking square roots. Uh, so let's look at a couple of scenarios here. We have one where it said to solve x squared equals 9. Now let's think about what that means. X squared means you're taking some number and multiplying it by itself, and the answer is equal to 9 when you multiply it by itself. So a lot of students will look at this and say, well, so oops, so x then equals 3. Um, but if you think about it a little bit further, you could say, well, there's another number that if I multiply it by itself, I get 9. And that would be, so I'm going to just write, or -3, because a -3 times a -3, and -3 times a -3 is also positive 9. Now, if we go over here and try to apply that to this other scenario, what number multiplied by itself equals -9? And in this scenario, you can say, well, that's not possible in the real numbers because 3 times 3 is 9, it's positive, and -3 times -3 is also 9. And so there's no real number that when I multiply it by itself, I get -9. So we solve that by remembering that I times I, or I squared, is equal to -1. And so I can say, in this case, that x equals 3i, or -3i, because 3i times 3i squared is the same as 9i squared, and I squared, another thing that we need to note here is that I squared then equals -1. And so when I substitute in -1 for I squared, I get -9. And if I've got -3i and I square that, the same rule applies. If I got a negative times a negative, that's positive. So once again, I get 9i squared, and then the I squared becomes -9. And so both of those, 3i and -3i, work. All right, let's read what it says here. It says all real numbers except 0 have two square roots, one positive and one negative. The square root symbol means the positive square root, called the principal square root. Both roots must be considered when solving an equation by taking square roots, so we use the plus or minus symbol to include both roots. The square root property. If b is a real number and a squared equals b, then a equals plus or minus the square root of b. Let's see what that looks like here. We've got x squared, so we're going to take the square root of both sides. And when we do that, we've got x squared, x squared, take the square root, equals the square root of 50, and I left a little space in between that 50 and the equal sign, so I can write my plus or minus. Remember that plus or minus. So the square root of x squared is just x. And then I've got the square plus or minus the square root of 50. Now, a lot of times you could just put that in your calculator and get a decimal, but a lot of times in math class we need to simplify it. And so I go back to 50 and I say, what are the prime factors? 2 times 25 is 50, and 25 is 5 times 5. And so I have a pair of 5s that can come under the out of under the radical, and I would get plus or minus 5 square root, and then the under the radical stays 2 under the radical. So x equals plus or minus 5 square root of 2. And just so that we understand what that means, it's -5 square root of 2, or +5 square root of 2. For number 2, we got 3d squared equals 48. Now, before we use square roots to solve, we first want to get the squared part alone. So it's right now with the 3. We're gonna get rid of that 3, which is multiplication, by dividing. Divide by 3, divide by 3. D squared then is equal to 48 divided by 3 is 16. Now I can take the square root of both sides. D squared square root equals plus or minus the square root of 16. D then is equal to plus or minus 4, which we can write as -4 or +4. All right, let's go to number 3. I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. That cancels, and I get 2n squared equals 100. Again, what I'm trying to do here is isolate the squared part. So I've got n squared. I want to get that alone. So I divide by 2. N squared then equals 50. And we have already done this part. So we're going to just take the answers that we found from this one up here, because x squared equals 50 is going to have the same answer right here. And so n then is equal to -5 square root of 2 or +5 square root of 2. And I will see you in the next video. Just a moment.